everyone, and welcome back to the Guardians of Liberty. I am your host, Nathan Parada, joined as always with Zach Taylor. And today is part 2 of our discussion with the Christian Libertarian, Ben Keymichael. Welcome back to the program, Ben.
Thanks for having me back, guys.
Roads to Liberty presents the Guardians of Liberty with your hosts, Nathan Parada and Zach Taylor.
All right, everybody. If you were here for last week's episode, we had a discussion with Ben Keymichael, the Christian Libertarian, about the intersection between Christianity and libertarianism. And since we didn't get through everything we wanted to talk about last week, we are here once again to continue the discussion. I'm glad to have you back on.
Thanks for having me back, guys.
You went a little robot there, but we can roll with that. So we got about halfway through our discussion last week, and part of that, like, we could have gotten a lot farther. I need to apologize to everyone. I was not on my best game last week. It was a rough week for me. But we got a lot of questions in various places after the first episode went up that people wanted to ask us, combined with some of the questions that we have already received. So you have a list of the questions. Is there one that really jumped out to you that you really want to tackle right away?
Well, why don't we hit the ever-present wasn't Jesus a socialist question?
That's a fun one.
Yeah.
Right.
So
take it away.
Yeah, let's talk about that. And really, this comes in two different places. Jesus himself, hey, he advocated taking care of the poor, go feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, visit the people in prison. Oh, that just means we need a big nanny state to do all these things for us. So, my normal rebuttal to this is that Jesus didn't advocate for the Romans to come and tax people higher to take care of the poor and the needy, right? In fact, in contrast to saying that, if we just do the right things, poverty will go away, Jesus in Matthew 26:11 says, the poor you will always have with you. What? In other words, the poverty is not a solvable issue that's going to go away if we get the right government policies in place. There's always going to be people in material need because of circumstances or personal choices, and helping such people is a duty of the church as a way to bring the gospel to them. And so to take charity from the church and make it part of the state, to deny the church a core part of its mission. That said, right, Jesus's commands about this are inherently personal commands. They are not collective commands of thus shall society do. They are, you, my followers, when you see the hungry, feed them. When you see the thirsty, give them something to drink, right? This is very much an individual thing, not I pay my taxes, so I've done my duty. This is that neighbor 2 houses down who just lost their job and can't pay their rent this month. What can I do to help them? And that might be writing their rent check or buying them a bag of groceries and taking that to them, or buying Christmas presents for their kids, right? This is how do I serve the poor and thereby further the mission of spreading the gospel to people. Go ahead.
And I can't remember if this was a Ben Shapiro thing or a Steven Crowder thing, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I have seen them before. When you break down the counties that give the most money per capita to charitable organizations, almost none of them voted Democrat in any meaningful way. So it seems to me that a lot of the socialist argument really stems from people being really, they're too lazy, or they're too selfish to want to give of themselves to a lot of these charity organizations, or to go help someone. They want the good feelings that come with doing that kind of work, without the effort and the struggle and the loss that comes with putting in that kind of effort. Would you agree that that's a thing that we're seeing?
I don't know all the individual traits necessarily behind it, so I'm not going to try to reach into the psychology of people that way. But the statistics that you're talking about, I've seen them as well, and that's very much correct. It's very much a libertarian and conservative thing that is very giving on top of taxes, where liberals generally do not give nearly as much on top of taxes. So in other words, by correlation on this here, the people who advocate the most for the nanny state, the high tax, high welfare kind of society, are the people who are least willing to buy the bag of groceries for their needy neighbors.
Yeah, this is something I like to call the arrogance celebrity effect. You remember back when we were having that big refugee debate, and all these celebrities with these multi-million-dollar homes in gated communities would come out and say, we need to let the refugees in. And I'm just sitting here thinking, how many of these people can you fit in your mansion? How many of these refugees that you want other people to bring in and pay for, how many of them are going to be living in your gated community? Now, the answer is inevitably none. You got celebrities with multi-million-dollar mansions spread out throughout the entire country. They're not going to put up any needy family in their homes. No, they're not going to do that. They have absolutely no desire to voluntarily do what they want other people to be forced to do. This reminds me of this video I saw. I can't remember what the group was. It was like millionaires for taxation. I can't remember what the name was, but basically the group was a group of quote-unquote millionaires who were advocating for their taxes to go up. And I asked them straight up, well, why don't you just write a check to the government? Why don't you just do that? Why don't you do voluntarily what you say you want people to force you to do? And the answer I got was pretty much, well, taxes pay for schools. They pay for my roads. They pay for all this good stuff that we want. And they essentially just dodged the question the whole time. But yeah, this is what you see a lot of the time for a lot of people who are on the political left of the spectrum. They expect the state to do everything for them and take no personal responsibility upon themselves to actually do the things they want to see happen. And it's a frustrating thing, and they seem unaware that they can actually do the things they advocate without being forced to do it.
Yep. And the second place where this question often comes in, Christianity and socialism, is from the Book of Acts in the early church. Book of Acts, chapter 2. The scripture reads, "And all those who believed were together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together, breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." And so, I've heard arguments that this means, again, Christians should be socialists. Hey, they're the early church people. They lived together and held everything in common. They gave to everyone as they had need. This is straight up Marxism, right? The key to understanding is this was entirely voluntary. Right. And, even as we read that, they were selling their possessions. So did they throw them all in one pot right off the bat? No. They were distributing the proceeds to all. Well, was this the church demanding all the property and then the church distributing the proceeds? No, this was individual people giving to others in the Christian community as they had need. Day by day, breaking bread in their homes. Okay, well, obviously they didn't get rid of their homes or socialize their property. So all of this is very voluntary based. No command was laid on them to do this. And as the church spread and formed in different cities, none kept this model. This worked for a particular place in a particular period of time. And just like, there have been a lot of different voluntary communes that have worked for some period of time all around the world. And that's a perfectly good model if people want to do that voluntarily.
Yeah, it's a key
I
word,
think it's
voluntarily.
I think it's really important. Oh, we got an echo somewhere.
I think only you were hearing that.
Oh.
No, I was hearing it too. Hello.
Okay. It seems like it's mostly gone. So I think it's also important to point out that the early church spread amongst the lowest classes first. And even Jesus talks about that. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to see the kingdom of heaven. Or I'm probably butchering that a little bit because it's been a while. But the early church was not full of a lot of wealthy people. And when you're someone who
I wouldn't actually say that that really holds. I mean, we have case after case of rich people sponsoring the apostles. We have large properties hosting early church gatherings because almost all of these churches gathered in somebody's actual home. And so you're right that a lot of poor people came to the church, but a lot of the backbone of the church, or meaning the place where people often gathered in a Christian's home, were wealthy Christians who had a place where hundreds of people could come together on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, and that's still kind of true in a lot of church circles now. I guess what I'm trying to say is a vast majority, maybe not a vast majority, but a lot of the early converts were slaves. And we've seen, especially when you get closer and closer to Rome, because sure. it's a religion that promises something for your suffering. And the people who were suffering the most were the ones who were more open to that in the beginning. And so something that we see in humans who don't have a lot of resources is a willingness to pool those resources to provide a better situation for everyone, because that's a smart economic strategy when you're on the bottom.
Yep.
So I think, and I think it even holds true when you have a couple wealthy benefactors. It's still a smart strategy to raise your group up, because as the group gets stronger, your individuals get stronger because of their connection to the group. So it's, to me, socialism is the dragging down of the people on top, whereas Christianity was about the lifting up of the people on the bottom. I think that's, to me, the biggest difference.
That's a good point. Yep.
Yeah, if I can say one thing about the socialist Jesus argument, it's kind of funny to me that almost all the time I hear it, it's from people who have nothing but disdain for Christianity as a whole, but they still think for some reason that their interpretation of a book they've never read outweighs your interpretation of a book that you've studied since you were a kid. Jesus was a socialist. Oh yeah, well, why don't you tell me about a little bit of the theology behind it? Why don't you prove to me using, biblical references that he was a socialist? Well, somebody once told me that Jesus wanted people to share, and sharing is socialist, so therefore you must be a socialist. Now, it's really the combination of two idiotic thoughts. One, that your stupid interpretation of a book you've never read is somehow valid, and two, the idea that sharing equals socialism. I don't know how that became a thing, but I keep hearing it. I mean, I heard Stephen Colbert the other day say that essentially socialism is sharing. No, they're not. Socialism is not sharing. You can share and not be a socialist. So it always strikes me as funny. These people who are just hardcore atheists are trying to tell you that Jesus was a socialist. just one of those weird things that people on the left like to do.
Well, I mean, these are the same people who will typically have the bumper sticker that'll say socialism, the radical notion of sharing. Like, that's
Yeah,
what socialism is, really.
They'll have a coexist sticker, but they hate Christians.
Actually, one of the other questions that somebody had brought up was about, Christian versus libertarian family values. And, there's a lot of different ways that Christians talk about family values. And I'm not sure there is such a thing in general as libertarian family values. But this concept of sharing, right, as a parent of young children, you often find yourself in a place where you're breaking up fights and trying to determine, whose toy is this, and at least in our family, things like you shall not steal, and this idea of property rights really work well as a way to try to resolve kind of conflicts inside your house between your children. And you can hear of different ways of how people govern these things, but one of the things in our house is pretty strong idea of property rights. Hey, if my children earned something, if my children were given something, right, it's theirs. They don't have to share their toy with a friend. They don't have to share their toy with a sibling. They own it. Now, there can be social consequences to not sharing your toy, right? Your friends might not want to come over if all you're going to do is hoard all of your toys and not let anybody else play with them, right? But that's a social consequence that you need to learn and choose what you're willing to share. And so while I think my job as a parent is to encourage my children to think about this, I'm not going to step in and force them to hand their prized possession to some other kid. Right. And I think we do a disservice when we try to shove that idea on our children that sharing is this paramount thing that you must master. How do we weaken the ideas of property rights when we do that? At the same time, right? Mom and dad own the house in this house. And so the family room is a common area, and mom and dad get to make some rules for the common area. And that might mean no toys get left here overnight. So you get your toys out of the common area because other people need to have equal access to the common area. And, that's mom and dad watching TV at night and not tripping over your stuff all over the floor. So at least in my experience, the way we've done this in my family is Christian family values and libertarian family values are really one and the same, because everything flows from this idea of property rights and how do we resolve conflict through an application of property rights.
So if I can touch on this for just a second, and we talked a little bit about this in the pre-show, so I want to give you a chance to talk about this while we're recording. There's a lot of people who are really deep in the kind of the anarchist side of the party, who believe that spanking or corporeal punishment is a violation of the non-aggression principle. And a lot of those same people also believe that Christianity preaches corporeal punishment with that verse in Proverbs. And I'm going to let you talk about that so you can kind of, I think your answer was a lot better than anything I was coming up with. So
sure.
Go ahead.
There's a couple of different verses, but generally the verse that gets quoted is spare the rod and spoil the child. And the idea is, if we don't bring physical discipline to our children, we will have spoiled them and they are going to end up behaving like little monsters. And so I don't know that I necessarily have a definitively right answer in this. In our family, the way we've viewed corporal punishment is kind of the same way that I view, I carry a handgun sometimes, and I'm ready to use that to defend myself. And sometimes there are actions that my kids take where a corporal action is in some ways an act of self-defense. One of my daughters a number of years ago got so mad that she took a swing at me. And you got a physical response for that, because that's not okay. That's not an appropriate way to act. But in general, right, we don't expect policemen to use physical action as the immediate response to every violation of the law. So why, as parents in households, would we expect that? So kind of in my view, that's the option of last resort, and I really never want to actually use that. And other than that one example, pretty much all the discipline that I do with my kids falls way, way short of that. And some of this is, not adopting a one-size-fits-all approach to this. Mm-hmm. But back to your question of, does the Bible require this? I think some things have been lost in our cultural understanding, right? To the agrarian culture that lived in Israel in the time frame that David was king, and shortly thereafter when Proverbs was written, we had a lot of people who were in farm communities, and sheep and goats were the primary meat, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And you would have shepherds who would end up taking care of this flock and moving it around to find water, to find grass. This is a fairly arid region, so us in North America, we just throw some cattle out in the pasture and there's plenty of green grass. But that isn't how it is over in the Middle East, right? And so a shepherd would have to move these animals from place to place so that they could graze, find enough grass to eat, a mouthful here and a mouthful there as they moved around. And so the staff of a shepherd was really used for two purposes, right? You needed to pull your flock together, and you needed a weapon to use against wolves or bears or lions or other predators that are coming after your flock that you're defending. And if we think of a shepherd's crook, right? Do we, even our modern conception of shepherds, do you regularly beat your sheep when they go astray? Or are you pulling them back in safely so that they can be protected where they need to be, and they can be guided in the direction where they need to go to find food and find water and find shelter? And so I think in our interpretation of that verse, we've lost this idea that shepherding is very much a gently leading people and guiding people in the right direction. And sometimes that means using that shepherd's crook to pull them along in places that they don't necessarily want to go. But that really never means beating them up.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I like that. Nathan?
Well, here, let me go back to the viewers' questions. I have one from Jared Hall, and it says this: what would your response be to this comment? Libertarianism is dehumanizing. It pretends not to be, but when you are in those waters long enough, you will see that it serves corporations, not people. Now, this is from an individual who used to be a libertarian, but now is more on the progressive side of the aisle. So what would your response to a statement like that be?
Well, I think, in modern politics, people often confuse libertarianism with still some form of crony capitalism. But I think the response from the Christian libertarian side is Christianity puts a lot of emphasis on humans. As we were talking about earlier, a lot of the downtrodden, a lot of the servants and slaves in the Roman Empire adopted this because it was an inherently humanizing idea. This God became man to live among us, and in fact died in our place so that our relationship with God could be restored. And this cuts through whether you're rich or you're poor. And, Paul talks about this numerous times, that, in Christianity, there's not colors of skin, there's not degrees of wealth, right? We are all brothers and sisters, heirs with Christ of this promised kingdom, and are sharing this same mission of going out into the world, preaching the gospel to people. So Christianity itself is inherently humanizing. And so in this libertarian approach, I would have to ask some questions back to somebody like this. If we look at the practical implementation of socialism in somewhere like Venezuela, is it humanizing to these people to not be able to buy toilet paper, to be
not real socialism
for food? If we look at the old Soviet Empire, if we look at North Korea, and we're like, a defector who is part of the military and is probably the most provided for, who is in such horrible health and infested with worms because their food quality is so bad. And is this inherently humanizing, that these people can't get enough to eat, can't get quality food, can't get medical care? In a libertarian society, we believe in these basic property rights. And I believe that is inherently humanizing to say, if you own something, it's theft for somebody else to come along and take it away from you.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about this is that they seem to think that capitalism, which is what they're objecting to here, is that capitalism imprints upon people a certain set of values that they need to now follow. Like the common complaint about libertarian ethics is that it's so consumeristic, as compared to, I don't know what, socialism, communism, as though those aren't, at all concerned about materialism. But the fallacy here is that, no, capitalism does not tell you what to value. It does not tell you what to want or what to need. It simply allows you the freedom to choose your own course of action. I've made this point before, and it needs to be hammered home. Capitalism doesn't tell you, look, these are your values and these are what you need to strive for. It merely allows you the opportunity to go after what your values already are. And so it's not dehumanizing at all. It's liberating. It's liberating to say, you own your life. You own your body, your mind. Those belong to you. And it is morally evil for someone to come in and violate that right. Your mind and your body are the only two things that you were born with in this world. Every human being is born with a mind and a body, and you have an inalienable right to both of them. And whenever you mix those things with the natural world, that is your property, and you have just as much a right to that property as you do to your own body.
Exactly, and I think in this idea, again, foundational property rights is really the core of this, and I do think that there are ways that capitalism can run to excess, but the solution to that is the human heart and his generosity, not the government stepping in and saying, changing the rules, taxing things and taking from people. And so on. Just
to kind of throw in here so people can kind of understand some of the things we're talking about. The average height in North Korea, which is about the longest running socialist, communist, whatever country right now, is 5'5" for men and 5'1" for women.
Hey, I'd be tall in North Korea. Awesome.
Whereas the United States is basically 5'10" and 5'4".
Oh, now I'm short again.
So females, it is not really out. Like 40% of the females in America are taller than the average man in North Korea. That is the difference between the remnants of capitalism versus socialism.
Okay. Let's actually compare North Korea to South Korea, because then we're
2 inches different.
2 inches different, right? So make sure we get that in the same people group.
Okay, that's fair. So South Korea is North Korea is 5'5" and 5'1". South Korea is 5'8.5". So it's 3.5 inches different on the male side, and 5'3" female. So it's 2 inches different on the female side.
So, I mean, we're talking about the difference that having good nutrition, because we have a free market system where property is valued, where people can buy things with their money, this creates a major difference in the well-being of people over their life.
Yep.
It's funny that the quote-unquote dehumanizing effect of capitalism is to create larger humans. Yeah, so dehumanizing, people are actually taller in capitalistic nations.
I mean, capitalism is creating a problem in the West where we are fat. Like, I'm fat. Because there's so many things that I can eat, and I choose the worst ones of it. Like, capitalism is so good at providing that it is providing excess, and people like me are not very good at stopping from the excess.
See, this is the problem of people making the perfect the enemy of the good. Because capitalism doesn't create perfect societies. But guess what? There's no such thing as a perfect society. That has never existed, and it never will exist. Human beings are not perfect. Therefore, any society we build will be inherently imperfect. So to compare capitalism to some ideal utopian vision you have in your mind is asinine. You need to compare to other systems that we've had, and compare to every other system that has ever come into existence. Capitalism is far superior.
Well, and I think there's another aspect to this too, right? To adopt any other system requires a huge amount of authoritarian ideas. And what we have seen over and over and over and over through all of human history is whenever somebody gets a huge amount of political power, they are going to misuse it in ways that cause a massive amount of human death and human suffering. And so, even if we ignore the strictly capitalist understanding of this, the ideas, the implementation it requires to force people to share causes huge amounts of harm.
Okay, let's move on to another viewer question. This one is from Mike Kniebel. What's your thought on a just war? Does the Christian view of war differ from libertarian, or are they compatible?
So there's a number of different things on this, and I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a single Christian view. I mean, we're kind of used to the neoconservative view, that's been practiced in American politics recently, which has often had some kind of Christian backing, but it really does not, probably does not fit any kind of Christian model as far as war theory, right? So just war theory was something developed by the church a long time ago. I'm drawing a blank on which philosopher that was, but this has certainly been something that's been developed over time, trying to decide, hey, in the same idea that common law is developed, when nations have a conflict.
Thomas Aquinas.
There we go. When nations have a conflict, how should that conflict be resolved, and at what point should we go to war? And really, a lot of it follows the same ideas as when should a person actually turn to violence in self-defense? And then there's also questions too about if you're a third party witnessing this kind of an action, do you get involved or don't you get involved? So there's certainly some broad theory on that. Just war theory, Thomas Aquinas started that. There's been a lot of philosophical debate over that over time. In this whole concept of the military, though, I actually let's hit a passage in Deuteronomy. So this was again a passage specifically for ancient Israel about how it worked, but I think it's an amazing way to look at military service, especially since we've seen this concept of conscription so widely used across so much of history. So Deuteronomy 20, when the nation of Israel needs to go to war, the officer shall speak to the people saying, hey, is there a man who's built a new house and hasn't dedicated it? Let him go back to his house in case he dies in battle. And another man gets to dedicate it. Is there a man who's planted a vineyard and not enjoyed its fruit? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle and another man enjoy its fruit. Is there any man who's engaged to be married, but hasn't been married yet? Let him go back to... And Marry her, lest he die in battle and another man take her. Then the officer shall speak to the people further and say, is there a man who's fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he makes everybody else afraid. And then when the officers have finished speaking, appoint commanders at the head of the people. Well, what do you think this actually leaves? Pretty much an entirely voluntary military force, right? You've let everybody go home who wants any out at all. Mm-hmm. So we certainly can knock the idea of conscription out from what Scripture clearly tells us. So I don't know. Do you guys want me to talk about that some more, or is that kind of a complete answer there?
So I actually want to touch on this a little bit because having been a soldier, I think that sometimes libertarians don't rationally think through their anti-war stance all the time. I think that there is a libertarian justification for a war that is not purely defensive. I think that if you have a weak, innocent party who is being aggressed upon, if I see that as a person, it is okay for me to step in and protect that person because they're being aggressed upon. And I think that if we have a military force that is volunteer, there is an argument to be made for stepping in to protect people who are being aggressed upon. I think the big problem that we have right now is we're using those arguments as justifications to go into wars that aren't so cut and dry. All these Middle Eastern wars, for example, have been sectarian violence that we inserted ourselves into, claiming that one side was innocent and one side was guilty, and that's really not what was going on. But I think there is, at least in theory, a place for war in libertarianism to protect people who have been aggressed upon.
Yeah, and I think you're right, but I think really this is the application of the same concepts of self-defense taken to a higher scale.
That I would say there's two responses from a libertarian view for that. The first response is purely utilitarian. You're never going to be at peace if you apply that standard consistently and in all cases. We'd be at war with everybody all the time. And number two, sure, the individuals volunteering to go fight may be volunteers, but the taxpayers aren't. Right. You know, it's not so much. It's not so much you jumping in and helping a third party. It's you seeing something going down, going over to your neighbor, taking a weapon out of his home, and then jumping in to do something. You know, that would be the standard response to it. That, yeah, sure, the soldiers, airmen, Marines, in a lot of cases may have up and volunteered, to fight. Maybe reason, and that's another potential issue. But you're bankrupting the nation in the process of going out and fighting endless wars that you're never going to be at peace, and you're going to bankrupt the country in the process. That would be my response to those issues.
Yeah,
that's a good argument. Like, I think that there's arguments on both sides of this that we shouldn't. I guess I get upset when you have libertarians who are like, well, there's only one libertarian position on this, and it's like the point of libertarianism sometimes is that there is no libertarian position. You can approach something with the non-aggression principle in mind and get to a different conclusion.
Yeah, and that's fair. That's fair. I mean, it's one of those things that libertarians have to hash out and debate among ourselves. But I mean, libertarians can hold different views in good faith. Like I don't consider the pro-life versus pro-choice libertarian debate as a debate between one side that's libertarian and another side that's not. I see it as two sides that are applying the non-aggression principle in different ways, and it's internally consistent with themselves, one might be wrong and one might be right, but I don't think you're a bad libertarian depending on what view you take. You may be a bad Christian depending on what view you take, but you're not a bad libertarian depending on which side you fall on. But I want to get through more of these viewer questions. Let me see. Where's an interesting one? Here's one. Ben, do you ever feel misunderstood by people in your faith due to your libertarian views? And I'll add on top of that, do you ever feel alienated from libertarians because of your Christian views?
Yes to both, actually. I think there's a lot of people who, from a Christian point of view, kind of think you're a nutcase who doesn't have your doctrine right if you believe in libertarianism. At the same time, I think there's actually a very much growing group of people inside of Christianity who are tired of the kind of the conservative bent towards big, strong military, lots of money on military spending, and who never actually practice what they preach in reducing the size of the government. And so what I'm seeing is a large resurgence in what I'll call classical liberalism among a lot of Christian people who are saying, the government is too big, the government's doing too much, it's stomping on the toes of the church in the social sphere. It's taxing us to the point where it's hard to be charitable because, if the government takes 30% of my income, it's really hard to give on top of losing that much already. So I think we're seeing a resurgence that way. And yeah, from the libertarian standpoint, I think there's been plenty of people who, as soon as it comes out that I'm a Christian, it's an immediate negative response from people of, you can't possibly be a Christian if you believe in God. You haven't rejected all authorities if you believe in God. And so I think though there's probably been a lessening of that over the last 10 years as well, as there's been more of an influx of people with a libertarian political mindset from a variety of religious backgrounds. And so that atheist libertarian is probably a much smaller percentage of libertarians today than it was a decade ago.
That's probably true.
I think it's still the majority, but less so. Yes.
I think there was an interesting poll on the Libertarian Party website that asked for religious affiliation. I think the largest single block was atheist, but you have to remember that every denomination of Christianity was its own choice. So I think if you put all of that together, all the Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, and Catholic denominations together, I think they did outnumber the atheist block, but I don't think it was by very much. All right, here's another question. Oh, we already did Jesus was a socialist. When the two ideologies conflict, how does a Christian libertarian resolve it? Does your Christian values overrule your libertarianism or vice versa?
Well, I think there are people out there like me who call themselves Christian libertarians, and then there are people who call themselves libertarian Christians. And I think your choice of wording on that probably actually tells how you resolve any of the conflict between the two. And so for me, it's very much I'm a Christian first, and I'm a libertarian second. But I think the point of some of our conversation here is I really don't find much of a place where there's a conflict to resolve.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, we're running out of viewer questions. Here's one from Patrick. How does the non-aggression principle jibe with Jesus telling the apostles to go forth armed with the sword? Luke 22:35-38. Then Jesus asked them, when I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Nothing, they answered. He said to them, but now if you have a purse, take it and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. What is written, he was numbered with the transgressors. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. The disciples said, "See, Lord, here are 2 swords. That is enough," he replied.
All right, well, 2 swords isn't enough to start a political revolution. So we can rule out any idea that that's what's going on here. So how does this resolve with the non-aggression principle? Well, so what does the non-aggression principle have to say about libertarians, say, carrying concealed handguns for self-protection? Doesn't the non-aggression principle say that when somebody acts as an aggressor against me, I have the right to retaliate, to remove that aggression? So what is carrying a sword except the ability to do so? But in a broader context, for this particular passage, right? So this is leading up to when Jesus is going to be betrayed and carried off. So earlier in his ministry, Jesus had sent out his disciples and sent them out without purse, bag, sandals, and really said, "Hey, as you preach my message to people, it's the job of the people who receive this message to provide physically for you," right? Very much the way this worked in Jesus' ministry was the disciples would go out and they would preach to people. They would be invited to stay in people's homes. They would be provided meals and necessities by the people that they were spreading this message to. And they lacked for nothing as they did this. But now everything's drawing to a point. Jesus knows, I think this is right before he goes off to Gethsemane and gets arrested. And he knows, hey, all of a sudden this ministry, the way it's been operating, is ending, and you guys are going to get scattered, and you're going to get chased, and you're going to be the enemies for a time here. And so where you didn't take a cloak to go and minister before, you didn't take a purse, you didn't take your own money, hey, grab that now, because now you're going to be running for your life. And part of that is, you need a sword to be able to defend yourself.
All right. Got a few more here. I'm just kind of going to rapid fire them to you. How do the concepts of the golden rule, non-aggression principle, and economic and social ostracism relate to Christianity versus libertarianism?
So I think we talked a little bit about the golden rule and the non-aggression principle last week or last episode. But, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And, we talked a little bit about how this is pretty much love your neighbor as yourself, or the second of Jesus' 2 commandments. Which, if we talk about Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, that's really the same concept. And the non-aggression principle is really just a restating of that same principle in a different way, in a more political way, as opposed to a strictly moral way. So in the light of all of those things, right, economic and social ostracism. Well, often these are used as a way to say, a way to punish somebody who is not using the values of the group. Hey, I don't like that person, I'm going to refuse to trade with them. I don't like that person, I'm going to refuse to associate with them. I'm not going to be their friend, and so on. And in Christianity, that is actually one of the specific ways to act with people who claim to be Christians, but then go off and reject core ideas of Christianity. Is to, the way Jesus tells us to approach this conflict is to go and talk to that person. If we can't resolve it, then take the elders of the church and talk to that person. And if the church itself can't then resolve the issues with this person, then we treat that person as though they were an unbeliever, right? And so we exclude them from the gathering of the church. And so that is very much a form of social ostracism. And this idea of economic ostracism is kind of very much in cultural debate today. That whole bake the cake versus not question, right? Should I, as a consumer, have the right to go and frequent businesses that I agree with their values and avoid businesses that I disagree with their values? And as a business owner, shouldn't I have the right to at least when my creative services are required, decide to decline people who want things creative in a way that my values disagree with. And so, but can these things be taken to an extreme? Could an entire community ostracize a person to the point where they would starve to death? Is that right? It's an interesting question. Not necessarily strictly a Christian one, though.
All right, here's one of my own. Oh, that echoes back. Yeah, I'm hearing myself. Okay, who would be your favorite libertarian philosopher, and who would you be your favorite libertarian theologian? It's Ayn Rand, isn't it?
No. Philosopher? I mean, one. I don't know. Let me throw out a few resources. Very much have been influenced by John Locke, so his Second Treatise on Government is a great place to start in this idea of liberty. Rose Wilder Lane's book, Discovery of Freedom. I think that was kind of influential to me in my journey. I love the way she actually brings up the religious background. She talks about how Abraham leaving Ur and following God, and ties that into political things, and does a fascinating job with that. But probably the person that I point to as my favorite libertarian philosopher is Bastiat. The law, the way he puts that into words, just fantastic. A libertarian theologian. I don't know that I could spit an answer out for that one.
Law is fantastic. Read it. It's awesome. Yeah, that made Bastiat, John Locke, those are great names to throw out. I mean, I've read both of them. They're both great. How are we doing, Zach? Do we have much time to keep going, or should we be wrapping this up here?
For an hour, we have about 10 minutes.
Okay. I think we're pretty much out of viewer questions to ask. Let me look at some of these real quick. How do Christians view the concepts of rational self-interest in relation to altruism? There's an Ayn Rand inspired question.
So, when I was thinking about this question, Ayn Rand was all about only acting from this idea of rational self-interest, and to the point where charity and things like that were reduced to, I perform charity because it makes me feel better, so it's a rational self-interest. And I think from a Christian view, we would definitely take a different take on it than that. We practice generosity because God has been generous to us. And so this is much more of a human reflection of what's been divinely done than something that I expect to get something out of. So how does this relate to altruism? Well, I wouldn't actually consider Christian economic philosophy to be altruism. The Bible doesn't just say, go out there and do everything for everybody. The verse that's coming to mind right now is the Apostle Paul, who was speaking of charity inside the early church and of people who were essentially living off of the welfare of the early church, and made the statement, if a man will not work, he shall not eat. And the idea here was the church has no business supporting able-bodied people who simply refuse not to work. And so how would we call that altruism if the church says, hey, if you're not going to stand up on your feet and pull your own load, then we're not going to help you out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's also important to keep in mind here what altruism means in a Randian mindset. It's not just helping somebody. It's putting someone else's values ahead of your own. It's sacrificing what you believe to be good and right for the sake of what you believe to be evil. You know, this idea that self-sacrifice, that destroying your own values is inherently good. That's kind of the idea of what altruism is from an objectivist point of view. So when you hear altruism in this context, it doesn't mean just helping other people. It means sacrificing what you believe to be a high value, something that is good, for something that is of low value, for something that is, you know, less important, or even in some cases evil. So that's important. It's an important distinction that a lot of people don't make.
Yeah, I mean,
and
having made that distinction, I would think, you know, Christianity actually would back Ayn Rand on that point. You know, to adopt a Christian mindset would require me to align myself with God's values. If I presume to judge God's values in such a way that I'm trying to operate, as Ayn Rand would say, is an altruist, then I'm placing my belief system or imposing my values, so to speak, on God. And so that kind of leads to this interesting conundrum of how are you acting as a Christian if you actually don't agree with Christianity? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
So this is more of a, I guess, on the theology side, but kind of at the base of libertarianism. I had a professor once make the argument that Paul was pro-slavery because of the letter. Which letter was it? Where he was harboring the escaped slave.
Philemon.
Yeah, Philemon. Thank you. It's such a cool name too, and I forgot it. So she made the argument that Paul was pro-slavery because he was sending Philemon back to his master, and that the Bible was pro-slavery because slavery is talked about in the Old Testament. I can make arguments against this, but I was wondering if you had anything that you could kind of touch on this topic a little bit.
The scripture and slavery. I think one of the ideas that we need to understand from the very beginning here is that slavery, as it was practiced in America, was radically different than slavery practiced in the Bible, and slavery even practiced in the Roman Empire. And so there was a massively dehumanizing aspect of slavery as practiced in America. And so a lot of times, you know, you might hear people make a distinction between American slavery being chattel slavery. We treated these people as property, where if we went back and we looked at slavery in the Old Testament or slavery under the Roman Empire, you're talking about a person who was in a particular position of allegiance to work for somebody. And so a lot of modern translations of the Bible even talk about this as a bond servant or almost as a worker, because in a lot of these situations, you still had the ability to live in some place. You still had the ability to move around as you wanted. You weren't clapped in chains in the same way. So going back to the Old Testament, right? And kind of a distinction to be made there as well. As Israel conquered Canaan and some of the other nations, they were allowed to take slaves of some of those people groups. And those people were generally, considered household servants. They ate the same food as the rest of the family. They stayed in the same house as the rest of the family. They were a worker whose pay was their keep and did not necessarily just have the freedom to leave. And then there was slavery between Israelites. And this could be, hey, I took a loan out and I couldn't pay it back because of whatever reason. And so my way to actually pay it back is to become a slave of that person for whatever period of time it takes to pay it back. But this was term limited, right? This wasn't unlimited for life kind of situation. And
It was 7 years, wasn't it? Like
the Old Testament law has this idea of the Jubilee. And so things were very much time limited, including land transfers. Land was owned by family groups, and its ownership in those family groups was considered perpetual. And so even if you sold your land after 49 years, it would revert back to the original family and so on. So, I mean, they had some very interesting laws about that on the 7-year and then on the 50-year time frame. So very different slavery than what was practiced in America. And so inside that framework, just like we kind of talked about Paul in Romans 13 saying, you're not political revolutionaries first. You know, what would have happened to early Christianity if early Christianity came out and tried to upset the entire Roman social order overnight and said, slaves, stop obeying your owners and be free and do whatever you want?
Considering that most, we talked earlier, most of the early adherents were slaves, the religion gets wiped out.
Exactly. And so I think, this comes back to even under oppression, we're Christians first, not political dissidents first. And so as much as possible, we're supposed to live peaceably in the society that we're in. And that meant for those kind of Roman slaves to exist. And Paul did say, if you can get your freedom, but don't run away.
I think that was a good way to wrap up that question. That was good.
Excellent. So, Zach, do you have any more questions you'd like to ask? I think we've gone through all the viewer questions. I think that's essentially all of them.
I think we've hit everything. It was a good 2 episodes.
Yeah, and to all the listeners out there who submitted questions to us, thank you very much for them. They provided a lot of content to talk about, a lot of very well thought out questions presented. So to everybody out there that presented a question to ask, thank you very much for your contribution. And Ben, thank you again for coming on for our 2nd episode. We didn't think that we were going to be talking for this long when we originally sat down and decided to do this, but this has been a very informative couple of episodes coming out right before Christmas time. So great timing to have the Christian Libertarian on then. So do you have any final words you want to say before we let you go?
Sure. Coming up here before Christmas, I wanted to quote some lyrics from my favorite Christmas carol, "O Holy Night." And in that carol, it actually connects a couple of very Christian concepts into the political realm. And as we were just talking about slavery, and at least how American slavery was so soul crushing, right? And the first verse of "O Holy Night," long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth, right? Christianity was very inherently humanizing, and it brought value to humans in society. And then in the last verse of that hymn as well, truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love, and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. So this has been sung for a couple hundred years as a Christmas carol, and I find it extremely moving to talk about the freedom that we get. One thing that we haven't talked about that I'd like to mention as we wrap up here is, Christianity talks about this freedom in the political realm and freedom of human action in an economic sense, but it also very much talks about freedom from sin. Right, we are bound up with desires, with actions that conflict us with doing things right, and Christianity acts to try to bring freedom in that sense as well. And so, in all of these realms, Christianity is trying to address the conflict between humans and how to help us live in a flourishing manner. And I would really encourage people to not consider this an aberration or a conflict, and really for Christians out there who might be watching this, wondering, hey, maybe I should be a libertarian. Definitely check out some of the resources that we've talked about. There is such a rich heritage of Christianity in classical liberal thought that I think modern libertarianism has kind of lost as it grew very atheistic, and I'd love to see a swing back to those concepts from Locke and Bastiat in that classical liberal tradition.
Well, thank you, Ben, once again for coming on the program for 2 weeks in a row. It's been an enlightening conversation. I hope that our viewers get as much information out of this as myself and Zach have had. So thank you again for coming on. All right, everyone. Well, that was our discussion with Ben Keymichael. An interesting last couple of episodes. Really glad that we were able to do that. So, well, that's all I've got. You got anything else you want to say?
No, I think we covered it.
Oh, by the way, Nebraska volleyball national champions. Woohoo!
5 times. The ladies equaled the football team.
Yeah, they finally did it. You know what? If the football team's not going to be any good, it's a good thing that we have volleyball, because 2 years ago, the same exact thing happened. The football team sucked, and the volleyball team brought us out of depression. So thank you, Lady Huskers. Thank you so much for that.
I personally, I would really rather watch a volleyball game than a football game, and I know someone's going to be like, oh my God, this guy, but volleyball's a fun sport. And I'm not just saying like you get those creepy guys who are like, oh, I really like women's volleyball. No, volleyball is an awesome sport, and it doesn't stop. It is so entertaining. It
is pretty entertaining. It's a fun sport. It's a lot more fun than a football game where you're losing by 40 points in the third quarter.
That's definitely true.
A lot more fun than that. All right, well, that's all we have. It's been nice talking to you, everybody. Thanks for stopping by, and you have a good night.
Have a good week.